cover crops, understanding and using cover crops. And this is a subject where I'm going to ask for your forgiveness because I'm going to wax poetic, and Hannah may have to rein me in, but boy, there are so many advantages to understanding and using cover crops. It's hard to know where to start as far as putting together the presentation. But we'll be covering quite a bit of material, and at the end I will have some resources for you to take a look at to get an even more in-depth exposure to cover crops. And I'll mention at this point, and I'll also mention at the end, there's an excellent book that was developed by USDA SARE called Managing Cover Crops Profitably. And I highly recommend that book to everyone who has an interest in cover crops. It's available in hard copy, and it's also available as a downloadable PDF. As Hannah mentioned, this workshop is a partnership with Springfield Community Gardens, with University of Missouri Extension, and with USDA. And Springfield Community Gardens, I really like their vision. Their vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local foods. And they have a number of programs to work towards that vision. The area that this particular workshop is serving is the Beginning Farmer Program. And Springfield Community Gardens has a farmer incubator. They have a website with excellent resources for beginning farmers. And they have other support systems and programs in place to help those who are thinking about food in any form, growing food in any form, from a backyard garden all the way up to a commercial scale farm. So please reach out to Springfield Community Gardens for more information on their programs. And the USDA, of course, is a huge supporter of local agriculture. And through funding from the USDA, we are able to provide today's workshop and our workshop series at no charge. And as Hannah mentioned, we're going to ask for your help in filling out a survey to assess the impact of this particular workshop. This information is very important as we report back to the USDA and demonstrate to them that we're using the funds that they have so generously provided in a responsible way. The USDA has a number of agencies within the umbrella. The Farm Services Agency is the entry point in most counties. And anyone who is interested in the programs available through USDA are invited to visit their Farm Services Agency office. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has a strong emphasis on local agriculture and specialty crop production. They have a number of programs in place to support farmers. In many cases, these are cost share programs that can actually provide financial support for farming practices that help conserve our natural resources, our air, water, and soil resources. One to single out, for example, would be the high tunnel cost share. And they have a number of cost share programs that are focused on cover cropping practices. So again, reach out to the Natural Resources Conservation Service for more information there. The Risk Management Agency is another agency of the USDA that has direct application for small scale farmers. And all of these agencies are described, and there's more information on the farmers.gov website. So let's talk about cover crops. And this is the outline of what we'll be doing today. We'll first have an introduction, a broad introduction to cover crops. We'll talk a little bit about history because I'm a bit of a history buff. But then we'll move into the benefits and uses of cover crops. And we'll talk about how to manage cover crops to really see these benefits. And then we'll focus on Missouri. And we'll talk about using cover crops in Missouri. We'll talk about some cover crop species that are particularly well suited for the growing environment here in Missouri. And then we'll end up with putting it all together and talking a bit about how cover crops might fit into a rotation on a specialty crop farm. As Hannah mentioned, if you have any questions at any point during the workshop, please enter those into chat. Hannah will be keeping an eye on that, and she'll prompt me, and we'll tackle those questions as they come in. So what is a cover crop? People have told me that, well, weeds are actually cover crops, and they find a niche when there's a part of the garden or the farm that's not being occupied by a crop plant, and they grow. And, in some ways, you could think of weeds as cover crops, but basically cover crops are plants that we are utilizing, that we are deliberately planting into niches, and we're growing these not so much for their harvest, but for the benefits that they provide for the crop that precedes and the crop that follows. A cover crop is a crop that offers many benefits, both in the short and the long term. And I think at the end of our workshop today, hopefully you'll agree with me that, yes, indeed, these benefits are huge. And again, a ongoing program of incorporating cover crops into production cycles on a farm has long-lasting benefits. And cover crops are tools. They're tools to help maintain the environmental sustainability of fruit and vegetable production systems. And again, I think by the end of our workshop today, we'll have explored some of the ways that we use those tools. Let's talk a bit about cover crops and history. And this particular picture comes to us from Southeast Asia. And there are soils in Southeast Asia that have been cropped for millennia and remain productive. And we actually have much to learn from some of these long-term production systems. And one of the aspects of long-term productivity in these systems was the recognition very early on that cover crops have an important role to play. And for example, in around 500 BC, there was a description of using cover crops in China. For manuring the field, black gram is best, and small beans and sesame rank second. They're broadcast in the 5th or 6th month and plowed under in the 7th or 8th month. Their fertilizing value is as good as silkworm excrement and well-rotted farm manure. So early on, Chinese farmers recognized the value of planting plants and then plowing them under to see the benefits. If we look at Greece and Rome, there was a report from Theophrastus in 287 or before 287 that I mentioned that beans were turned under as a cover crop. Varro, just before the time of Christ, said certain plants are cultivated not so much for their immediate yield as with forethought for the coming year. So in other words, looking ahead to the coming year. And these crops were then cut and left lying on the ground to improve the land. Farmers were using lupins, beans, and other crops to benefit the soil in this way. Then if we turn to medieval Europe, we saw several reports from Italy, for example, where there was a description of the use of lupins as a cover crop, where they were cut down with spades, laid down in furrows, and then the grain was sown into the furrow, and the furrow was covered, and the crop cultivated in this manner produced a plentiful crop next summer. There was also a report from Milan talking about radishes and the benefits of using radishes, and also lentils. And again, there's been a number of reports that the lupin has been used extensively. And lupin, of course, is a legume. And as we'll see a little bit later on in our workshop, legumes have definite benefits, both in terms of harvesting nitrogen from the atmosphere and making that available to plants, and also just the nutrients stored in the plants when they are cut and turned under are then released for crop use. Looking at the situation in the United States, we began to see sustained interest in the 19th century. And we had reports, for example, of using clover in wheat fields, cowpeas in the South as cover crops. They're particularly in the South, cotton and tobacco production was very hard on soils. And farmers learned before long that after a number of cropping cycles with these two crops, land was abandoned. But then we began to wonder how to bring this abandoned land back into productive use. And the USDA sent Hiram King to investigate these Asian models, where again, food has been produced on these soils for 40 centuries while maintaining productivity. And he wrote a very interesting report called Farmers of 40 Centuries and talked extensively about cover crop use in Asia. And this information then began to be adopted by American farmers. Well, now that we've kind of set a historical context, let's take a look at the benefits of cover crops. And these are sort of general introductory benefits. We'll dig deeper into some of these a little bit later on in the workshop. But one aspect of using cover crops is they can cut fertilizer costs. Legume cover crops in particular contribute nitrogen to cash crops. These crops harvest nitrogen from the air, and through an association with a type of bacteria, actually make this nitrogen available through their root systems for cash crops that follow. Other cover crops actually mine and scavenge soil nutrients. They may have deep-ranging root systems that bring nutrients from deep in the profile up into the area of the soil where crop plants can utilize them, or they may capture nutrients that are in the soil following a cropping cycle, hold those nutrients, and then when the cover crop is terminated, the following cash crop can utilize those nutrients. And this table just illustrates some of the benefits of nitrogen fixation for various leguminous crops. And if we look, for example, at hairy vetch, an extremely efficient legume crop as far as harvesting nitrogen, 100 to 120 pounds per acre nitrogen contributed. And that's adequate nitrogen for many cropping cycles of cash crops. Cover crops also reduce the need for herbicides and other pesticides. They can be used as smother crops that outcompete germinating weeds. They can also be used to block light from the soil, to keep weeds that do grow from germinating and becoming dominant. And the residue that follows after a cover crop has been terminated can be very effective at blocking light from the soil and reducing weed seed germination. And then there's an active aspect to this as well. A number of cover crops display what's called allelopathy, which we'll discuss a bit further on. But basically, allelopathy is the crop plants releasing from either the above ground part, the root system, or both, chemicals that actually inhibit the germination of certain types of weeds. Cover crops are a critical part of maintaining and enhancing soil health. And some of the benefits of cover crops that help support the life in the soil, they speed infiltration of excess surface water. So instead of water being lost, it then moves into the profile of the soil, where it then is, of course, needed for the life in the soil. It relieves compaction. Cover crops also moderate temperature fluctuations, and we'll see a slide a little bit later on looking at the radical difference between a soil covered with a cover crop and then a bare soil from the standpoint of temperature. Cover crops are huge in adding organic matter to the soil, both from the biomass that accumulates on the surface, but also the contribution of the root systems of the cover crops. Cover crops provide what are called root exudates from their root systems. These are substances that are released from the roots of cover crops that then enter the rhizosphere and are used as foodstuffs for the life in the soil. And cover crops are an important part in nutrient cycling, and we'll talk more about that here in a bit as well. In fact, let's talk about nutrient cycling right now. And if we look at nutrients in the soil, nutrients, of course, are critical for supporting the life in the soil, but they're also critical for higher forms of life, insects, for mammals, and for birds. And if we look at this diagram, we look at, first of all, what's called the trophic level, the first level of nutrient cycling, and that's the capture of energy from the sunlight by plants. And then using nutrients in the soil, water, and air, this process generates organic matter. And then as organic matter is developed in the soil, as plants die or plants are terminated, then the organic matter, a portion of it is utilized by soil life, such as fungi and bacteria. As these second trophic level decomposers break down this organic matter, nutrients are released that can then be used by third, fourth, and fifth level organisms in the soil food web. So again, all life depends upon the activities related to what's going on in the soil, and specifically the soil food web. Cover crops also prevent soil erosion, and this was one of the recognized benefits early on that encouraged the use of cover crops. And in this country, up until the middle years of the 20th century, soil erosion was a very serious issue on many soils. Soils were cropped continuously. There was no provision for maintaining cover on the soil or maintaining crops that could hold the soil in place. And we lost tons of topsoil from many soils, and many soils became much less productive because of this issue. But through the use of cover crops, first of all, root systems of these crops hold the soil in place. And then the parts that are above ground, the growing parts, and the residue that is present after the cover crop is terminated, actually protect the soil from raindrop impact. It's very interesting to think about the impact of a raindrop. And it doesn't sound like much, but the impact of raindrops on the soil surface actually can lead to crusting and the development of impervious layers that then enhance the runoff of water from that soil rather than the movement of the water into the soil. And so having growing parts of the cover crop, and particularly having the residue present, maintains the structure of that upper layer of soil, which encourages infiltration. And over the long term use of cover crops will definitely enhance water infiltration and lead to less water runoff. Again, as I mentioned before, there are short-term benefits, but in particular, farmers are interested in the long-term benefits of sustained cover cropping use. Cover crops conserve soil moisture, and we talked about why that is. Residues and the activity of the root systems actually increase water infiltration. And also we see reduced evaporation from the soil by using cover crops. And we can, through the practices of maintaining soil structure and enhancing organic matter in the soil and developing soils that take water into them into them efficiently, we can develop drought-resistant soils. And this is an interesting picture. This was from a project at Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, looking at 20 years of cover cropping, no-till, and manure versus conventional tillage and synthetic fertility management. So if we look at the corn on the left, this was the corn grown on the cover crop no-till manure site, and then the corn on the right, conventional tillage and synthetic fertility management. This was in a dry year, no added irrigation. And again, notice how taller and better growth is on the corn from the cover crop no-till manure plot versus the conventional plot. Cover crops also protect water quality, and certainly when we think about non-point source pollution, agriculture is a major contributor to non-point source pollution, and cover crops can help mitigate this particular issue. The irregular use of cover crops reduces the loss of sediments from a farm. It also, as we've mentioned several times, will help hold nutrients in the cycle on the farm. In other words, they're not lost to runoff and then moving into to water sources, which can then become a problem. And the same thing applies to ag chemicals. First of all, in general, with cover cropping systems, we use fewer ag chemicals. And then secondly, those ag chemicals that are used that end up in the soil stay in the cycle. They're not lost to erosion, again, where they would end up in our streams, lakes, and rivers. And cover crops, even you can look at sort of the big picture, and they help safeguard personal health. As I mentioned, frequently farms that are utilizing cover crops can use those cover crops to replace the use of a number of ag chemicals. And of course, reduced reliance on ag chemicals has impacts on individual personal health for the people working the farm, but also for the community at large. And of course, there's reduced pollution from these farms as well, as we just noted. Now let's turn our attention to soil fertility and tilth. And Hannah, before we go any further, do we have any questions?
We don't have any questions currently.
Very good. Again, as I mentioned earlier, any questions, please type them into the chat and we will tackle them. They can be anything related to cover crops. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the soil itself. And let's talk first about erosion protection. And again, the loss of soil through erosion it can be devastating. We can see the loss of fertility in productive soils, and it's very difficult to restore that fertility. It takes centuries to generate an inch of topsoil, and you can lose an inch of topsoil in one storm incident. So let's talk about how cover crops can help make soils erosion proof. First of all, looking at the root systems actually enmesh and anchor soil aggregates. And we'll talk about aggregates here in a moment, but a healthy soil actually has the physical components of the soil and the organic matter of the soil arranged in what are called aggregates. And these are clumps, if you want to think about it that way. And these clumps are glued together by substances formed by soil life. And root systems of cover crops help support this activity. You know, as we saw before, they actually help support the life in the soil. They help encourage the activities of organisms that help generate aggregates, and then their root systems, once these aggregates are formed, enmesh and hold the aggregates in place. The above ground parts of cover crops, the living foliage and the residue, protect the upper layers of the soil, as we mentioned, from issues such as raindrop impact and also from traffic on the soil. We have water movement slowed down over the soil, and by slowing the movement of water over the top of the soil, we encourage the infiltration of that water into the soil. And as we'll see here in a moment, the long-term use of cover crops, particularly selected cover crops, will increase soil organic matter. And soil organic matter has implications on water holding capacity, water infiltration, and the life in the soil that generates a soil that can then hold that moisture for plant use later. And on the subject of organic matter management, we should talk just a bit about what organic matter is. It's a term that's thrown around a lot in sustainable agriculture, and sometimes there's not a clear understanding of exactly what it is. But in the overall picture of the situation in the soil, organic matter is the portion of the soil that was once a living organism. And in a typical soil, it's a fairly small component, but a very critically important component of the solid matter of a soil. Organic matter is carbon-based molecules and compounds of various sorts.
And the living organisms that eventually become organic matter contain nutrients. And when these living organisms die, the decomposition of their bodies in many cases releases these nutrients in forms the plants can then utilize. Cover crops are important because they help build soil organic matter over time. It's easy to degrade soil organic matter by improper culture practices, but the goal in a managed soil, particularly soil that's going to be used for cropping, for ongoing cropping cycles, is to maintain and build the level of organic matter in the soil. And cover crops can certainly play a role in just that. So why do we care about organic matter? Well, it stores nutrients, it stores water for plants to grow, both of which, of course, are critical for plant growth of the cash crop. It's easily lost or degraded if we don't manage it properly. And quite frankly, the health, the function, and the productivity of soils depends on organic matter. And we as gardeners and farmers need to be keeping this in our mind at all times as we manage the soils that have been entrusted to our care. I promised to show you an aggregate. So here is a sort of a diagram of an aggregate. And frequently what we have at the center of these aggregates is organic matter, organic debris. And that organic debris supports the growth of and life of bacteria and fungi in the soil. And bacterial colonies that collect around organic particles, as they grow and develop, they actually release substances that are a bit like glues. Okay, and these glues help hold together not just the organic part of the soil, but also the mineral part of the soil, the mineral particles. And then we see the additional activity of fungi. And fungi grow and develop, their bodies in many cases are filamentous. They're like long threads. And these threads then can enmesh and grow around the various components of the soil, both the organic parts and the mineral parts. And they further help hold together these sort of three-dimensional aspects of the soil, those aggregates that we talked about before. And aggregates are important because as they form, there are actually voids between them where water can enter the soil. The voids also serve as a source of oxygen, which supports the life in the soil, both the microbial life, but also the life of the roots of plants that are growing in that soil. So again, we need voids, we also need the aggregates, and we need to have soils that are resistant to compaction, which removes the voids, and soils that are able to maintain the aggregates in the soil, in other words, the aggregate stability. And these are the soils, the soils that can do that are the healthy soils, and these are the soils that are fertile and productive soils from the standpoint of especially crop production. Some more thoughts on organic matter. Organic matter is the source of nitrogen, and for every 1% organic matter in the soil, there's about 20 pounds of residual nitrogen in that soil. And that organic matter is also very effective at holding moisture for plants. Every 1% of organic matter in the soil, for a square yard of that soil will hold about 3.6 gallons of water. Organic matter also helps moderate soil temperatures, as we'll see a little bit later on. It improves soil structure and aggregates. It provides nutrients to plants, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, but also other nutrients as well. And it supports the life in the soil microorganisms that are near the base of the soil food web that we saw earlier. Now, organic matter it's not a fixed point in a soil. It's a dynamic part of the soil system. And you see changes among the different forms of organic matter. And if we look at what is in the soil that could be considered as organic matter, both living and residue organic matter, about 5% or less of the soil is actually living organisms. Of course, that's a critically important component. About a little bit less than 10% of the organic matter in the soil is fresh residue. And then somewhere between 33 to 50% of the organic matter in the soil is actually in some stage of decomposition. Okay, so we start with living organisms, then we have fresh residue, and then we have decomposing residue. This is this 33% to 50% component is called the active fraction. And then we have what's called stabilized organic matter. We call this SOM, or we call this humus. And this portion of the soil is fairly stable. It is possible to adversely affect this particular portion, but in general, it's fairly stable. And building the stabilized organic matter component of the soil is a long-term process. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in 1 year. It's a long-term process. But as we develop production systems that encourage and enhance organic matter in the soil, we will see growth in the stabilized organic matter part of the organic matter in the soil. Now, let's talk a bit about tightening the nutrient loop. In other words, how can we maintain nutrients in a production setting and in a system? And as we mentioned earlier, losing nutrients from a system can lead to problems. It's certainly expensive for the farmer. It also leads to non-point source pollution and can lead to lots of issues at the societal level. And so whenever possible, it's in the farmer's interest and the gardener's interest to maintain nutrients in a production system. So the first thing that cover crops do is they increase infiltration of water. And nutrients typically move into the soil in a dissolved form in water. And so, for example, if manure is applied to the soil surface, or if a conventional fertilizer is applied to the soil surface, the nutrients in that fertilizer will go into solution, and they can enter into the profile then in that solution. And having a soil that can take water into it well through infiltration is a soil that will help maintain the nutrients. Secondly, the soil that is healthy, a soil that has been nurtured with cover crops, is able to hold moisture. And we see less water that moves through the profile carrying nutrients with it. In other words, the solution stays in the profile, stays in a portion of the soil where it's available for plant use. We also see a reduced loss of nutrients from the surface erosion of soil. When we think about erosion, we think about soil loss, but anything that's been applied to that soil is lost as well. Cover crops can also be used for what are called catch cropping. And that's where a cover crop is planted to take up excess nutrients that might be present in the soil. Cover crops are plants. They utilize nutrients as well. And if there's been a situation where the cash crop has not utilized the nutrients in the profile, then we can plant a cover crop following that cash crop to capture those nutrients, hold them in place, and then make them available when that crop is terminated. And then, of course, we have legume cover crops which actively harvest nitrogen from the atmosphere and make that nitrogen available to the crop that is then planted after them. So again, our goal here is to hold nutrients in the system. Okay, our goal is to maintain nutrients and minimize the loss of those nutrients. And again, just another diagram. This is a bit complex, but if we start at the beginning, we have nitrogen coming into the system from direct applications from the standpoint of the farmer, but also from the decomposition of organic materials and through the active capture by legumes, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And then once these are in the soil, the decomposers go to work, and they put these nutrients into a form where they can be utilized by the plants. And as we can see, the nitrogen can go through several different states, ammonium, nitrites, and nitrates. And again, as mediated by the life in the soil, these nutrients can then become made available to the cash crop that is planted into that soil. But again, it's also very easy to lose the nitrogen in this ecosystem. It can be lost from volatilization from the soil surface. It can be lost from erosion from the soil surface. It can also be lost by leaching through the profile. So again, cover crops play a critical role in maintaining the nitrogen in an ecosystem or in a cropping system on a farm. Another thing that we need to consider is how nitrogen and other nutrients too move from available forms to unavailable forms. And there are two processes, the processes of mineralization and the process of immobilization, that we should talk about, and we'll further define these a little bit later on. But if we look at nitrogen in the soil, when nitrogen is tied up in living organisms, in bacteria and fungi, or in the plants that are present in the soil, that nitrogen is typically not available for use. In other words, it's being actively utilized by living organisms. But when those organisms die and their bodies are decomposed, again, then we get into that active organic matter portion of the soil, and then the nutrients are usable by plants and are mobile in the soil. And so the process where nutrients become available is called mineralization. The process where they become less available and tied up is immobilization. And we'll want to keep these concepts in mind a little bit later on when we talk about the particular activities of specific types of cover crops relative to nitrogen in the soil.
Patrick, we have a question in the Q&A.
Yes.
From Christina, how do we use cover crops to support the soil for perennials? I have rudbeckia, coneflowers, and lilies, to name a few of the perennials we have.
Yes, and we'll actually delve into that where we're talking about more or less permanent cover crops. And there are cover crops that we can utilize in permanent cropping systems, perennial crops, for example, like your rudbeckias, your daylilies, or crops like asparagus, for example, or berry crops or even tree fruits. And in those cases, we want to select cover crops carefully because we have to think about the interaction over the long term between the selected cover crop and the crop plant. For example, we need cover crops that are not competitive for the crop plant from the standpoint of nutrients. We also need cover crops that are not competitive from the standpoint of water. Now, sometimes, cover crops, particularly permanent cover crops, do have requirements as far as nutrients and water. And we need to think about managing the cover crop just as we need to think about managing the cash crop in that setting as well. But some of the commonly used permanent cover crops would be things like non-competitive perennial grasses. They could be things such as non-competitive broadleaf cover crops. Some of the clovers, for example, such as microclover and subclover, might be utilized. Another situation that we can use is actually annual cover crops in perennial cropping systems. And this is a common situation, for example, with strawberries, where we might plant a cereal rye cover crop between the strawberry rows, and then we press that down or otherwise terminate it in the spring. And that kind of a setting, that type of a cover cropping approach could be used with perennial flowers as well. So again, a non-competitive cover crop can very nicely be integrated with perennial plants. Do we have any other questions, Hannah?
Not currently.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into nitrogen and cover crops. And let's talk first about non-legume cover crops. And so these are crops that do not harvest nitrogen. These are crops typically that they could be broadleafed or they could be grassy crops, but they are crops that do not harvest nitrogen. So if we're using these cover crops, we have to recognize that they will require nitrogen for their growth. And this can be a useful situation if there's nitrogen still in the soil following a cash crop. These crops can be planted, they will harvest the nitrogen to support their growth, and they will hold that nitrogen in place. As these crops are terminated, as they are killed, the biomass is then broken down by microbes. And then the biomass, as it's broken down, in that point can release nitrogen. But recognize that if there is not enough nitrogen in this biomass to support the microbes that are doing the decomposition, then these microbes will harvest additional nitrogen in the soil to support this breakdown activity. This is called immobilization. And so in this setting, as the biomass from the cover crop is being broken down, we can actually see a tie-up of the nitrogen in the soil, okay? Now, this may be a good thing as well, so because that nitrogen could be lost to leaching or some other point. But what it points out is that if you plant a cash crop immediately after terminating one of these crops, that cash crop may actually experience a nitrogen deficiency, at least in the short term. Now, if the biomass nitrogen is sufficient to support the microbial decomposition, then nitrogen is released during this process. And even if the biomass N is insufficient and we're tying up soil nitrogen in time, that nitrogen will be mineralized and become available to plants. But we have to recognize that there can be some challenges to using certain types of cover crops relative to the crop that's following after it. Now, we can get an idea if there's going to be an issue by looking at what's called the carbon-nitrogen ratio. And you can look at any organic matter source, any plant source, for example, and calculate what's called the C to N ratio. And if the C to N ratio is greater than 30, in other words, if the portion of that biomass has a 30%, or if there's 30% more carbon than nitrogen, 30 parts carbon to every 1 part nitrogen, then it's likely we're going to see a mobilization. And many cover crops will have, particularly grassy cover crops, will have a C to N biomass ratio that is greater than 30. So recognize that. Now, we'll talk about legume crops here in a moment, but there are some non-legume crops that have C to N biomass ratios that are less than 30.
things such as buckwheat, for example. And when the biomass of buckwheat is terminated and decomposed, there's sufficient nitrogen in the buckwheat to support the activities of those decomposing bacteria and fungi, and we actually see a release of nitrogen at that point. And keep in mind, these crops will contribute nitrogen back to the soil. It's not going to be as much as a legume crop, but generally 20 to 50 pounds per acre is expected. Now keep in mind too, that this contribution of nitrogen is not going to be immediate. It's going to be over time as decomposition proceeds. Now looking at legume cover crops, it's a different situation here. First of all, legumes do harvest nitrogen from the atmosphere, and then they make that nitrogen available to crop plants in a very short term. And through this activity of harvesting nitrogen, the crop can actually contribute a substantial amount of nitrogen, 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And for some cash crops, this may be sufficient for their season-long needs, but it certainly can contribute to the nitrogen needed for the cash crop that follows the cover crop. The C to N biomass ratio of cover crops typically is below 20 to 1. So in other words, these are crops that, as the biomass is broken down, immediately mineralize nitrogen, and then that nitrogen becomes available quickly. Just to talk a little bit about that fascinating relationship between legumes and bacteria that results in the harvest of nitrogen. These types of plants, and most of them are in the pea family. There are other non-pea family legumes or plants that can harvest nitrogen, but most of the cover crops we're considering here are in the pea family. And they have a type of bacterial called rhizobium that is found in the soil, and it forms a mutually beneficial relationship with their root systems. And this relationship forms what are called nodules. And you can see the nodules in these two pictures. The upper picture shows them kind of a pinkish color. The lower picture, they're white. Once the rhizobium bacteria infect the root system of the legume plant, there's a nitrogen fixing gene that's activated in the bacteria. And then through the mediation of the plant, this nitrogen is harvested from the atmosphere. The bacteria benefit from the association. They feed on sugars from the root exudates in the plants, and then they also fix nitrogen from the atmosphere for the plant to then utilize. So again, it's a mutually beneficial arrangement between a bacteria and a plant. A point that needs to be made here when using legume type cover crops, it's very important to inoculate the seed before planting. And what we mean here is that we actually will develop a suspension of the appropriate species of rhizobium bacteria in water, and then we will then submerge the cover crop seeds into this solution. Sometimes it's also done by using a powder. But in other words, the bacteria are then present on the seed at planting time. And then as those seeds germinate, the infection of their root systems with the rhizobium bacteria will take place nearly immediately, and we'll see the benefit. There could be a situation where there may not be rhizobium bacteria naturally present in the soil. An uninoculated seed may not form this symbiotic relationship, this mutually beneficial relationship with the rhizobium bacteria. So don't forget to inoculate. Just some quick comments about phosphorus. So along with nitrogen, phosphorus is the other nutrient that has been implicated in non-point source pollution from agricultural production. And phosphorus, it's dynamic in the soil. It can be present in forms that are available for plants to use and then present in forms that are not available. And there is evidence that certain cover crops may actually release acids into the soil from their root systems that can convert phosphorus into a more soluble form that is more easily taken up by plants. Another interesting piece of research that is coming out is that mycorrhizal relationships. So mycorrhizae are a type of fungi which also form mutually beneficial relationships with the root systems of many plants, including many cover crop species. And these mycorrhizae can actually help the plants efficiently absorb phosphorus from the soil. And then, of course, phosphorus in an organic form, as you know, it's released as plants and organisms decompose, is in an available form, and it will help the phosphorus in a cycle stay in that cycle, and that particular production cycle at that site. So through the mediation of cover crops, we see benefits from the standpoint of phosphorus cycling as well. So keeping in mind the different effects of non-legume and legume cover crops on activities in the soil, particularly related to nutrient cycling, maybe we should be looking at a mix of legumes and non-legumes, and that's indeed what we do in many situations. If we have the appropriate mix, we can actually have the benefits of biomass accumulation. Non-legume grasses in particular tend to produce lots of biomass. We can also mitigate the effects of immobilization. Yes, as non-legume cover crops decompose, they can tie up nitrogen, but if we have a legume component to the cover crop, we can actually supply nitrogen to the soil to support the decomposing activity of microbes, and that will minimize immobilization and enhance mineralization. The grass component scavenges nitrogen, which is then eventually available to the cash crop. It provides the biomass that decomposes slowly but helps build soil organic matter. The legume component fixes nitrogen that is more readily available to the cash crop, and the legume component breaks down quickly once terminated to release nutrients. So we get, in some ways, we get the best of both worlds here by using a mix of non-legume grasses and legume cover crops. Another benefit of cover crops is they can be living plows. They can actually break up soil layers that are undesirable, and they can mine nutrients that are deep in the soil. There are some types of cover crops whose root systems can penetrate to 3 feet in the soil, and these deep root systems can then utilize nutrients at those depths and carry them up into the upper part of the soil where they will be available to the cash crop. And then we have some types of cover crops, some of the radishes, for example, that have very robust root systems that can actually generate channels through impervious soil layers if they're used consistently over time. And this is a picture harvested from a YouTube video, but this farmer is holding a tillage radish. And again, notice that robust root system, which is easily penetrated to 18 inches through the soil. And we have many soils that have impervious layers that can be penetrated by the growth of a cover crop such as this tillage radish. When the radish then dies, the root decomposes and we have a channel then through the impervious layer. Another benefit of cover crops is they increase the number and diversity of soil organisms, and they do this by enhancing the environment in the soil. Certainly they add organic matter, which, as we've seen, is important. In many cases, the management strategy for a soil where we're using cover crops through the activity of the cover crops, we can reduce or eliminate pesticides, which frequently have a negative impact on soil life. We can also reduce or eliminate tillage. And here in a moment, we'll talk about conservation tillage and cover crops. And this too has a benefit from the standpoint of maintaining habitat for soil organisms. And then we provide a diversity among the plants growing at the site. Certainly we're going to have times at a site where we have the cash crop in place. But if we can intersperse cover crops, we provide a diversity. We provide different types of red exudates that support a diversity of soil life. The other thing that has to be pointed out is that healthy soils are soils typically that have some sort of plant growing in them at all times. It could be a cash crop, it could be a cover crop. But the fact is that the root system of these plants, be it a cash crop or a cover crop, are supporting the life of that soil. And a soil that does not have a plant growing in it in time will become a soil that does not have a habitat that supports soil life. In other words, you don't have the foodstuffs and the physical environment that supports soil life. So keep something growing at your site at all times. Okay, another aspect of cover cropping that we should talk a bit about is managing pests with cover crops. This is an area that is generating just amazing research, and we're still learning about what goes on in the soil relative to cover crop uses and managing pests. But what I'm going to report on is the result of a number of research studies here in recent years that have pointed out that healthy soils, and particularly healthy soils where health is maintained with the use of cover crops, are soils that we can actually grow healthier plants on. So again, the first statement, crops grown in biologically active soils resist pest pressure better than crops on poor soils. Okay, there's again some fascinating research coming out talking about the fact that healthy plants can physically and actively ward off infection from things such as diseases, nematodes, and even the damage caused by a number of insects. enhancing biological diversity in the soil. And what can we do to develop a biologically active soil? Well, we can add organic matter, we can reduce or eliminate pesticides, we can reduce or eliminate tillage, and we can provide diversity among the plants growing at the site. We just talked about that, didn't we? So again, very important. So let's talk first about insects. Cover crops can actually support beneficial insects. These two slides are showing a ladybug larva and then a parasitic wasp that is attacking aphids. And while these beneficial insects have an active phase where they're actively targeting a pest insect, they oftentimes have phases in their life cycle where they can utilize the resources produced by cover crops, such as nectar, pollen. Cover crops can also provide water to support beneficial insects, and they can provide physical niches, for example, resting places or nesting sites for beneficial insects. And in fact, many farms that are biodynamic farms actually maintain strips or beds or plantings that contain plants that support cover crops, if you want to call them that support beneficial insects. These are called insectaries. And it's a good practice to consider these. Here is an example of one of those settings. This farm is a diversified vegetable farm, and you can see green beans there in the very center and another legume next to it. But notice the beds of buckwheat. And buckwheat is an excellent insectary plant. It produces abundant blossoms. These blossoms are a good source of nectar and pollen to support beneficial insects, particularly some of the parasitic wasps that attack things such as aphids. So again, a nice example of using a cover crop to provide habitat for beneficial insects. What about diseases in cover crops? Again, this is an area where we're learning more through the efforts of research projects. But we know, for example, that there are protective layers on plants. These may be waxy cuticle layers or other layers on their foliage, on their stems, and on their fruit. And these layers actually provide a buffer, a protective surface that keeps diseases from attacking those plants. If those layers are disrupted, then the plants become more susceptible to disease infection. And activities such as tillage and spraying can actually disrupt these layers. And so if we can develop a system where cover crops replace tillage or reduce spraying, we can actually grow plants that are more pest resistant, if you want to look at it that way. In other words, they are more able, just because of their characteristics, to withstand the infection of diseases. There are also living biofilms on plants. These are layers on the plants that include beneficial bacteria, that include beneficial fungi, and in some cases, these biofilms actually provide naturally occurring antibiotics, if you want to look at it that way, that ward off disease organisms. And anything that disrupts these living biofilms can, again, make the plants more susceptible to infection by diseases. And pesticides, for example, disrupt these layers. Cover crop plant surfaces also support these healthy layers. And then the microbes on cover crops can then move on to the leaves of developing cash crops. We also know that the roots of healthy plants produce disease-suppressing substances, so we can actually disease-proof plants from soil-borne diseases as well. And healthy plants growing in a soil that is a healthy soil, where this health has been maintained and enhanced by the use of cover crops, are able to ward off diseases actively because of this. Nematodes can cause issues as well. And again, we know from research and also practical experiences on farms that conventional cropping systems without cover crops tend to develop a fairly narrow diversity of nematode species. And this narrow diversity favors plant parasitic nematodes, whereas soils of biological diversity tend to have diverse nematode species and lower numbers of plant parasitic nematodes. And in fact, these soils in some cases support the activities of predatory nematodes that feed on plant parasitic nematodes. Cover crops can help manage existing problems. We can manipulate soil structure and soil humus by the use of cover crops. We can also use cover crops as a non-host plant in a rotation. For example, if we have a soil where there is a parasitic nematode present, if we rotate into a non-host plant, there's no foodstuff for that particular nematode species. And over time, we can see a reduction in the levels of these types of nematodes. And we actually have some cover crops that have nematicidal properties. Some of the mustards, for example, can be used as nematicidal cover crops, where these crops are grown, then the cover crop is terminated, incorporated in the soil, and as the cover crop decomposes, it releases substances that can actually kill plant parasitic nematodes. And then, of course, we talked about weeds earlier, but certainly weed management can be accomplished with the cover crops as well. We have cover crops that are smother crops because of their rank growth when seeded at the proper level actually outcompete germinating weeds for water, nutrients, and light. We have cover crops that actively release compounds that can reduce or prevent the germination of certain types of weed seeds. The debris, the biomass left behind when cover crops are terminated, these are called killed mulches, can also suppress weed seed germination. And then living mulches, as we talked about earlier when we had the question come in about perennial crops and the use of cover crops. Living mulches, these are maintaining living cover crops. We can see some of the same benefits in managing weeds from the standpoint of having a living cover crop in place. Now again, we have to recognize here it's very important to choose living mulches carefully so that they don't become a weed or another issue that competes adversely with the cash crop. And again, just to talk briefly about allelopathy, it's a very interesting situation, and we're learning more about it through research and through farm experience. But certain cover crops actually release chemicals from their roots and from the residue of the chemical crop that inhibits germination of seeds. And to use as an example, one of the most researched examples is cereal rye. And as cereal rye is terminated, these allelopathic chemicals, the allelochemicals, are released from the biomass, and they're also released from the root system. And these allelochemicals inhibit the germination of small seeded weeds such as pigweeds, ragweed, and lamb's quarter. And it this weed suppression situation can last for some period of time after the cover crop is terminated. But certainly it can be helpful in helping a cash crop that is planted into a killed mulch that was generated by the growth of the cereal rye. And this is more and more a common practice on biodynamic farms to grow a cereal rye cover crop, to then terminate it and leave the biomass on the soil and plant the cash crop into that biomass. And then to see the benefit of the allelochemicals in inhibiting the germination of small seeded weeds. Now there's a renewed interest in what's called conservation tillage. In some cases, this is called no tillage or minimal tillage, but basically it's a farming system where we minimize disturbance of the soil. And when we combine the use of cover crops with conservation tillage, again, we can see cumulative benefits from this approach. And some of the benefits that we see from soil management, where we focus on both cover crops and minimal tillage, we see increased aggregate stability. One of the disadvantages of tillage, of course, is the disruption of soil structure and the destruction of aggregates. So minimizing tillage can help increase aggregate stability. And then when we enhance soil life in that soil through the use of cover crops, we can see even more stable aggregates. Increased water infiltration. Tillage, of course, destroys structure and causes the formation of layers that inhibit the infiltration of water. But when we focus on minimal tillage and we focus on cover crops, which actually enhance infiltration, again, we see a cumulative benefit. We develop soils that are resistant to erosion, both because of structure that encourages the movement of water into the soil and that benefit. But we also see the cover crop in place, and particularly when that cover crop is terminated, biomass in place that protects the surface of the soil from raindrop impact and holds moisture, slows down the movement of water across the soil. Improved nutrient cycling, as we talked about earlier. Improved water quality because we're holding water in the soil, we're holding water in place. And then enhanced biological activity in the soil. We talked about cover crops, but when we add to that the benefits of minimal tillage, we can develop an environment in the soil that is ideal to support soil life. Now, some reality checks here. Remember that the benefits of conservation tillage are negated by tillage, particularly frequent tillage, and we really can't have it both ways. We have to make a commitment to reduce tillage,
And yes, in some settings, there may need to be occasional tillage, and that can be fine, but we want to move away from continuous cycles of production and tillage. And then secondly, when we look at the cover crop component here, we need to focus on biomass. Certainly there are benefits to the living cover crop, but the particular benefits with conservation tillage and cover crops comes from maintaining biomass on the surface. Cover crops that provide minimal biomass really give minimal benefits. So we're focusing here on those cover crops that can generate sufficient amounts of biomass. Now, looking at the biomass or the residue, having that biomass in place is very helpful from the standpoint of nutrient management, as we've talked about. It enhances water availability for the crop that is sowed into the biomass. Cover crop residue also moderates soil temperature fluctuations. Disease and insect management are made easier, particularly weed management as well when we talk about pests, as we've already discussed. But all of these benefits are enhanced when we add cover cropping residue to conservation tillage practices. And I wanted to show this slide. This was from research work at the University of Missouri looking at a bare soil and also looking at a soil that had in place, this was a recently terminated cover crop. And notice the differences in temperature, same day, same time, adjacent plots. The plot that had the terminated cover crop on, the soil temperature at 6 inches was 77 degrees. The bare soil, the soil temperature was over 90 degrees. So again, a significant difference in soil temperature. Is this important? Yes, it is important. And again, just to look at what happens as soil temperature increases at 70 degrees, 100% of the moisture that's present in the soil is available for plant growth. If the temperature reaches 100, then only about 15% of that soil moisture is available for plant growth, and much of that soil moisture is then lost from either direct evaporation from the soil or from the transpiration from plants that are attempting to cope with that temperature. Temperature of 130 degrees, we lose all of the soil in the, or all of the moisture in the soil through evaporation or transpiration. And then we begin to see the death of soil life at 140 degrees. So it is important to think about soil temperature. And then of course recognize that cover crops in their living form and also in their biomass form after they've been terminated can help significantly in reducing soil temperature. Now, you've heard me say lots of good things about cover crops. Are there some negatives? Well, yes, of course there are. There's no such thing as a perfect situation from the standpoint of cover crops. Yes, cover crops provide real and ongoing benefits, but we have to use them in the right way. Some cover crops can serve as hosts for harmful insects, diseases, and nematodes. And when we're thinking about integrating of cover crops into cropping systems, if we're looking at rotations and where we might integrate a cover crop, we have to look carefully at the crop that is going to follow the cover crop and make sure that we're not setting up a situation where there could be harmful issues present as we establish the cash crop. We want to make sure that the cover crop fits into a rotation. You know, one of the strengths of rotations, of course, is to move from one crop into an unrelated crop. Now, grass cover crops typically work well with this situation, although we do have a few grass-based cash crops. Many of our cash crops are not grasses, and so using a grass cover crop can be an effective way to move into a non-related crop in the cycle. But we have to be cautious about cover crops that are related to cash crops. A good example would be the brassicas. There are a number of mustards and other brassicas that can be used as cover crops, and they're certainly indicated in many settings, but these would not be good cover crops to incorporate into a rotation of brassica cash crops. So again, something like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, those sorts of things. Residues on the soil can keep soils cool late in the spring, and this can be a disadvantage if our goal is to look at early planting of warm season cash crops. So we need to recognize that as well. And then some cover crops have the potential to become weedy if they're not managed properly. So again, you heard me use the word management here. Proper management can minimize the disadvantages of cover crops and maximize the advantages of cover crops. And so you always want to keep that in mind. When thinking about using a cover crop, the first step is to look at the niche that you have available and then match the right cover crop to that niche. Okay, let's talk about cover crops in Missouri now. This is such a pretty picture here. You can see a number of different cover crops used in this diversified setting. We have millet in there, we have grain sorghum, we have sunflowers, we have sun hemp, we have just a diversity of cover crop species in this particular picture. Now, when we talk about cover crops, we can differentiate them into two groups based upon when they grow. We have warm season cover crops. These are cover crops that are typically sown in the spring or summer, and most of their growth is completed during the warm part of the growing season. In many cases, these are annual crops, and they're killed by freezing temperatures that arrive in the fall. Now, this can be helpful because they're terminated by, a natural condition. And some example of warm season cover crops, buckwheat, sorghum, Sudan grass. A legume warm season cover crop would be cowpeas. Cool season cover crops. These are cover crops that are generally sown in the fall or the early spring, and much of their growth is completed during the cool part of the growing season, either in the spring or in the fall. Some of these are crops that can survive freezing temperatures and will overwinter in Missouri. Some examples would be Austrian winter peas and cereal rye. We can also differentiate among cover crops by looking at their life cycles. We have many cover crops that are annuals, and their life cycle from seed to seed takes place in one growing season. An example would be cowpeas. We plant those, they grow, they flower, they then generate seed all in one season. We have some cover crops that are biennials, and a biennial cover crop completes its life cycle in two growing seasons. It may germinate in one season, it may then overwinter, and then will flower and set seed in the second growing season. An example here is red clover. And then we have perennial cover crops. Some of these perennial cover crops are long-lived and may live for decades. Others are short-term perennials, which may only live 3 or 4 seasons. But typically, perennial cover crops will live and produce seed in more than one season. So they grow, they produce seed, and this will be an ongoing cycle for 2 or more seasons. An example is white Dutch clover. Now, what it all comes down to, of course, is selecting the right cover crop for the right niche, the right setting. So the first thing to think about when you're looking at cover crops is to decide if it's a cover crop that's planted in the spring, fall, or summer. And so again, looking at the place where you want to use it, where does it fall as far as the season? Then we want to think about the days to maturity. Typically, you get the best use of cover crops if you can plant them and allow them to grow until flowering or even later. And you need to have a long enough period of time in which to do that. Some cover crops are very short term. Buckwheat is a good example. It can be planted and you'll see benefit even in as short as 4 weeks' time. Other cover crops, you need to allow a much longer growing season to see the benefits. And so the niche for that cover crop would need to be a longer term niche. And then you need to think about how you're going to terminate it. Cover crops typically have a life cycle, yes, but there may be situations where we want to terminate or eliminate the cover crop before it's completed its life cycle. And we may be doing this because we want to see the benefit of biomass, or we may be doing it because it's time to consider planting the cash crop. So how are we going to terminate that cover crop? Is it something that will be killed by cold temperatures? Is it something that will be killed by an active practice on our part as a farmer by mowing, using tarps for termination, killing with a hoe using a roller crimper, or some other way? So we need to think about how we're going to terminate it. And we typically want to terminate cover crops before they produce mature seed. A cover crop that produces mature seed stands the potential to become a weed. And so we want to make sure that that isn't the case. In other words, we want cover crops where we want them. We don't want them growing where we don't want them. What is our goal too? Do we want to fix nitrogen, or is our goal to suppress weeds, or is our goal to increase organic matter? And there are cover crops that are appropriate for all 3 of these purposes. And then think about what is going to follow after the cover crop. What is the cash crop going to be? And again, as I mentioned, you don't want to plant a cover crop that is of the same family as the cash crop that will follow. Or you don't want to plant a cover crop that will generate a considerable amount of biomass and then try to plant something into that might be a direct seeded crop. If you've got a lot of biomass in the ground, it can be a challenge to plant something like carrots or beets into that soil with that biomass in place. Now, just some quick comments again on selecting cover crops. Is your goal nitrogen fixation, or is your goal heavy residue and high organic matter? So again, remember legumes. Legumes do a great job of fixing nitrogen, but typically they don't leave a lot of residue behind, and they don't contribute as much to soil organic matter. Grasses, on the other hand, such as cereal rye, Japanese millet, they produce lots of biomass, they produce lots of soil organic matter, but they don't fix nitrogen like legumes do. And as they decompose, they can tie up nitrogen in the soil. In other words, they immobilize nitrogen in the soil. Tillage radish and buckwheat, they don't fix nitrogen. They don't have high residue. They have their own function. So again, using these two here, you won't see the benefit of nitrogen fixation. You won't see the benefit of lots of biomass. But in the case of tillage radish, again, it can punch through soil layers. Buckwheat, an excellent insectary plant for beneficial insects. So again, they have their functions as well. And the bottom line here, as we talked about earlier, is oftentimes a mixture of cover crops can yield benefits in both nitrogen fixation and heavy residue and organic matter generation. Planting cover crops. So it's important that we generate some contact between the soil and the seed. And the better job we can do at developing seed to soil contact, the better germination and the better growth of the cover crop that we'll have. It can be helpful to actually prepare the seed bed for cover crops. Roughing up the soil with a hand rake can be done, in small scale, but actually preparing the seeding site for cover crops is just as important as preparing a site for a cash crop, okay? The seed can then be spread either by hand, it can be spread using a belly seeder, a fertilizer spreader, a broadcast seeder, or a drill. Particularly on larger scale plantings, drills are very effective. Covering the seed will enhance establishment. So covering the seed one way or another is going to be helpful in providing that good seed to soil contact. Finely seeded cover crops typically are not planted very deeply, whereas larger seeded cover crops can be planted more deeply, okay? And then if possible, it's helpful to water the cover crop seed after it's been planted to enhance germination. Here's some examples of seeding type equipment that can be used for planting cover crops. And the upper left, that's a cyclone seeder. And even with fairly large scale plantings, this can be an effective way. The drop type seeders that we see in the middle picture and the lower right picture can be used for small scale. There are attachments that you can put behind, walk behind tractors. That's an example there of a small drill attachment. And then for larger scale plantings, we can see the cyclone seeder behind the tractor there, and then the drill that is used on larger scale to plant cover crop seed. Now, terminating cover crops. Let's talk a little bit about how that can be done. It could certainly be done through tillage, but again, as we talked before, I mentioned before, there are negatives associated with tillage, but there are farms where tillage is a regular part of terminating cover crops. And this has the advantage, of course, of incorporating the cover crop residue into the soil. And, if tillage is indicated for some other purpose, for example, to prepare a seed bed, then incorporating cover crop residue as part of that can be helpful. Mowing can be a way to terminate cover crops. It's a quick way to terminate a cover crop, but it does have some disadvantages. First of all, the residue that's left behind after mowing is in small pieces. And these small pieces can then blow on the wind or they can be washed away by rainfall. And then they're less effective as far as protecting the soil surface. We talked about that at length earlier when we were talking about one of the benefits of maintaining biomass on the surface of the soil. Another disadvantage is that these small pieces of residue break down quickly. Now, again, this is, thinking about a biomass accumulation aspect here. If your goal is to release nutrients quickly, then having small pieces of residue can be actually an advantage. But mowing may have a place. Using a roller crimper can be an effective way of terminating cover crops. And the roller crimper works by breaking the stems. It kills the cover crop by breaking the stems. And one of the benefits of a roller crimper is that as it's breaking the plants down, it actually places the residue in one direction. It works best if the cover crop is large enough. With many cover crops, such as cereal rye or some of the vetches, it works best as the cover crop is actually flowering. One of the benefits of having the residue in one direction is there are now implements that have been developed that can seed into this killed mulch, if you want to call it that, the residue that's left behind. Because the stems are all in one orientation, the transplanter can work well in that setting.
Here's an example of a roller crimper being used on the front of the tractor, and then a drill that is seeding into the residue that's left behind after the roller crimper is passed. And we have a video here. Let's see if we can bring this up and take a quick look at a roller crimper in action.
So I'm James Alexander. We're here in Oxfordshire in the Cotswolds. We've got 700-acre organic farm and also 300 acres of conventional farm. We're here today in a crop of rye and vetch, which we're trying to crimp as part of a strive to go towards no-till organic. So this is one step, looking at crimping a cover crop instead of having to mulch it and plough it in. This is a crop of vetch and rye, which we're trying to crimp today. We've also got next to it, we've got a crop of vetch and oats. We've always traditionally used vetch and oats as our fertility building on the organic farm, but we find it very hard, or we can't crimp the oats. Oats will just grow back. So last autumn, September time, we planted the rye and the vetch. And so we're here now trying, as part of our trial, to crimp it. We started playing with the crimper out here beginning of May. We've had a couple of weeks break now and we're back out here now, and we'll probably start doing some from now until end of June, beginning of July, to try and work out if we can find the ideal growth stage for the rye and the vetch, and the best time to crimp it. So this idea we got from the Rodale Institute in the States, where they've done a lot of research into blade shape and roller shape. So this is the chevron pattern. What it gives us a constant, we've always got one contact point from each blade on when it's on the ground, which means we're putting the most weight onto the plants to do the crimping. This is just a 4.2 metre front mounted machine for us to use here on our trials. They're all bolt-on blades, so we can change them if we need to. They're also made of Hardox steel, so they're very hard and hopefully very hard wearing.
Okay, Hannah, are we back?
Yes, and
Okay.
I never knew that was called a crimper roller. I
Yes,
always thought that was just a tiller of some sort.
Well, the difference between a tiller and a crimper roller is that the crimper roller is working above ground, and it's
Right.
terminating the cover crop by breaking its stem in multiple places. And then you may have noticed that, and you can see in this picture as well, that the biomass is all laid in one direction. There's all one orientation to the direction of the stems. And in this case, you can see the seeder coming behind it can actually plant into the biomass that's in place. And then as the biomass dies and decomposes, it becomes a killed mulch.
Brilliant. That's so brilliant.
It's excellent, yes. Another way that we can terminate a cover crop is through tarping or occultation. And this particular approach, you place a barrier over the top of the cover crop, and by blocking the sunlight, the cover crop will then die, and then you end up with the accumulated biomass at the soil surface. And this is typically done, of course, on a fairly small scale. You're limited by the size of the tarps that you have available. And farmers frequently use silage tarps. These are widely available. They come in many sizes. Billboard tarps can be used as well, and those typically come in a 14-foot by 48-foot size. And here's a picture of a cover crop that's been terminated by using a tarp, and the tarp has been pulled off. You can actually see the nice seed bed that has developed here from the standpoint of excluding sunlight from the covering of over the cover crop. Another way that we can terminate cover crops is through winter killing. And we have particularly warm season cover crops that will not tolerate cold or freezing temperatures. And so we can grow a cover crop in place, a warm season cover crop, and then winter temperatures will kill the cover crop, and then the residue will then be in place for spring planting. Here's an example. This is a case where we were using, these are research plots, but we were using radish as a cover crop. In that center plot there, radishes will not tolerate cold temperatures, so we plant the tillage radishes in the summer. We grow them to size. We get the benefits of their robust root systems. And then when the weather turns cold, the radishes die. And then we'll have a nice seed bed then available for planting the following spring. Herbicides too can be used to terminate cover crops. And typically in this setting, we're using non-selective herbicides. There could be a situation where we might be using a grass-specific herbicide for a grass cover crop. Now let's turn our attention to some specific cover crops that are recommended for Missouri. And I'm going to break these into 4 groups. We'll talk about cool season cover crops first, and we'll look at the non-legumes, then we'll look at the legumes, and then we'll look at warm season cover crops, again, starting with non-legumes and then looking at legumes. And if we start with cool season cover crops, the ones that are particularly well suited for Missouri that are non-legumes include cereal rye, triticale, oats, oilseed radish, forage turnips, mustards and other brassicas, annual ryegrass, and wheat. And I've picked several of these out for a little bit of special attention. Cereal rye, people have called cereal rye the king of cover crops, and it's widely used, probably more so than almost any of the grass-type cover crops, and certainly any of the cool season grass-type cover crops. It's winter hardy. It can be planted later in the fall. This is a useful cover crop if you're growing a warm season crop that extends into the fall, and then when that crop is done, you still have a little bit of warm weather before it turns cold. You can plant cereal rye. You'll get germination, and then you'll get excellent growth the following spring. Excellent crop for erosion control, and it's easy to terminate with the roller crimper. Again, that video that we saw was using a roller crimper on cereal rye, and it works very well. You can develop a very nice layer of biomass that can be then used as a killed mulch in which to plant a cash crop. Cereal rye is drilled at 70 to 80 pounds of seed per acre or broadcast at 100 to 120 pounds of seed per acre. Oilseed radish, we've talked about this, rapid fall growth and deep taproots. It's useful as a summer and fall cover crop. It's a great nutrient scavenger, but it does winter kill in Missouri and is typically used as a fall planted cover crop. And then it's terminated by cold temperatures in the winter, and then the cash crop is planted into that bed the following fall. 5 to 6 pounds seeding rate for drilling, and then 8 to 10 pounds for broadcast. Annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass is distinct from cereal rye. They're 2 entirely different grass species. Annual ryegrass is fast growing, easy to establish. You do have to plant it earlier in the fall, though, than cereal rye to get good growth. There are a number of different types of annual ryegrass. It's used as a turf grass, it's used as a forage, but you want to select a cover crop specific cultivar so that it's easier to terminate. It can be a bit of a challenge to terminate annual ryegrass the following spring, so make sure that you use a cover crop type to make that a little bit easier. And it's drilled in at 12 to 15 pounds of seed per acre or broadcast at 20 to 25 pounds of seed per acre. Looking at cool season legume cover crops, crimson clover, hairy vetch, Austrian winter peas, and balanza clover are ones recommended for Missouri. And particularly the top 3, these are widely used as cool season legumes in Missouri. Let's take a look at those 3. Crimson clover establishes fast when fall seeded. It's moderate in its nitrogen fixing capacity, and it does combine well with other cover crops, particularly some of the grassy type cool season cover crops. Does overwinter, but it's easy to terminate. If you allow it to grow in place until it flowers, the blossoms are a huge boost for pollinators. And it's it's drilled in at 12 to 15 pounds per acre as far as seeding, broadcast seeding at 20 pounds per acre. And as we talked about earlier, be sure that you inoculate the seed to develop that mutually beneficial relationship between the rhizobium bacteria and the crimson clover root system. Hairy vetch, again planted in the fall, some fall growth, but very vigorous spring growth. They're a strong nitrogen-fixing legume, one of the best as far as harvesting nitrogen from the atmosphere, and it combines well with other cover crops. It's a common component of a legume, non-legume cover crop mix for fall planting. The seeding rate of hairy vetch drilled in at 15 pounds per acre, 20 pounds per acre if you're going to broadcast the seed. And again, be sure to inoculate the seed. Austrian winter peas, again, planted typically in the fall, but they can also be early spring planted. That rye pea mixture that we saw in the crimping video, the legume component to that was the Austrian winter pea. Strong nitrogen-fixing legume equal to hairy vetch, combines well with other cover crops. The seeding rate of Austrian winter pea is 50 to 80 pounds per acre if you plan to drill it in, 90 to 100 pounds per acre if it's going to be broadcast. And again, inoculate the seed. Now let's turn our attention to warm season non-legume cover crops. And looking first at the broadleaf one, we have buckwheat, and then we have a number of grassy types with the millets and sorghum sudan grass, and then sunflower and sunhemp are increasingly being used as warm season non-legume cover crops. There's so many good things to say about buckwheat. It's an excellent short-term cover crop. It's a great crop for beneficial insects. Looking at that lower picture, you can see the abundance of blossoms. You have to be a bit cautious about allowing it to grow to seed. There are some situations where buckwheat is allowed to grow to seed. It will reseed and sort of becoming an ongoing cover crop, even though the plant itself is short-lived. But to be cautious because it can become weedy if allowed to go to seed. The seeding rate, drilled at 48 to 70 pounds per acre, broadcast to 50 to 90 pounds per acre. And I mentioned here it's an excellent short-term cover crop, one of the best cover crops to incorporate into short-term niches. You know, if you only have a month between cash crop plantings, you can plant buckwheat and see benefits from that. Sorghum sudan grass and warm season grass, this is an excellent smother crop and frequently planted in sites that are being taken out of pasture or some other type of a more or less permanent system and then brought into specialty crop production. Frequently there's an abundant supply of weed seeds initially, and sudan grass, sorghum sudan grass is an excellent crop to smother germinating weed seeds. It's also allelopathic to some degree. The seeding rate for sorghum sudan grass is 35 pounds per acre for drilled seed and 40 to 50 pounds per acre for a broadcast seed. And then when we look at warm season legumes, there's really just a fairly small spectrum of crops that work well, and cowpeas are probably used more than anything else in Missouri. Again, an excellent warm season legume. It's a strong nitrogen fixing legume, good weed suppression if sowed at the appropriate rate. And again, the seeding rate, 30 to 90 pounds per acre for drilling and 70 to 120 pounds per acre for broadcasting. Now let's turn our attention to rotations. And several times during the workshop, I've talked about the benefits of incorporating cover crops into rotations, but how does that really work? I mean, how does it really, how can you really see the benefits of cover crops while using them in rotation with cash crops? And Iowa State University has put together an excellent publication on cover cropping and vegetable cropping systems. And the next several slides are taken from a table in that publication. That's listed in the resource. It's also listed there at the bottom. And it's a highly recommended publication. But if we look at an example here, let's take a look at example 1. And again, we're looking at this through several years, 4 years. And if we look at example 1, we have a situation where we're looking at starting off the season fall of the previous year by planting an oats and peas cover crop. The field peas will be winter killed. The oats are then terminated, and then we plant into that onions. After the onion crop is harvested in June or July, we come back with crimson clover, which is then in place through the fall. The crimson clover is terminated the following spring. Potatoes are planted into that. After the potato crop is harvested, then we plant sorghum sudan grass, which is killed by the winter. And then the following spring, we can plant into the residue a sweet potato crop. Following the sweet potatoes, which are harvested in the fall, there will be time to plant cereal rye. The cereal rye is then in place into the spring. It's terminated, and we can plant cucumber or vine crop into the residue that's behind. And then following the vine crop, we plant oats and field peas, and we start the cycle around again. Looking at example 2, we start out with a cereal rye and a hairy vetch planting from the previous fall. We terminate that in time to plant a pumpkin crop. Pumpkins are harvested in the fall. We follow that with cereal rye. We terminate that early and plant a broccoli crop into that. Following the broccoli crop, we plant buckwheat. Buckwheat is winter killed. We plant carrots into the buckwheat. The following spring, then we follow that carrot crop with crimson clover. The crimson clover terminates the next spring. We follow that with sweet corn, and then we follow the sweet corn with the cereal rye and hairy vetch rotation. So again, this particular bed, we can see the ongoing cycle here. Some other examples. Looking at example 3, we might start with oilseed radish. The radish is winter killed. We can plant an early crop of lettuce into that. Follow the lettuce with buckwheat. Buckwheat as a short-term cover crop here. We then terminate that, and that same fall we plant cauliflower. Once the cauliflower crop is harvested, cereal rye after that. Cereal rye is then terminated the next spring. We plant a warm-seasoned eggplant or pepper crop into the cereal rye residue. We follow the eggplant or pepper crop with triticale. That's terminated again the next spring. Then we plant an onion crop, follow the onion crop with oats and field peas. We terminate that the next spring. We follow that with cucumbers, and then we terminate that, plant the oilseed radish, and we're back around to our cycle. Another example might be rotation number 4. And with this particular approach, we have cowpeas to start things off. We terminate them by winter killing. The next spring, we plant sweet corn. After the sweet corn, we plant buckwheat. The buckwheat is terminated in time for a fall planted garlic crop. The garlic is harvested the following late spring, early summer. We plant sorghum sudan grass after the garlic. That sorghum sudan grass will be winter killed. The following spring, we'll plant pumpkins or winter squash. After that crop comes off, we still have time to get a cereal rye cover crop in the same fall. We terminate that the next spring in time for our potatoes. And then after the potatoes, we plant cowpeas. And then we return back around to that particular cycle. And then one final example that we might look at, we start off with a cover crop of yellow mustard. That's winter killed. We plant muskmelon into that. Once the muskmelon harvest is done, we then plant a mixture of cereal rye and hairy vetch. Again, that's one of those excellent combinations of a legume and a non-legume crop. We terminate that the following spring. We plant sweet potatoes. After the sweet potato crop is harvested, we have time to plant a fall triticale crop as a cover crop. That's terminated the next spring. We plant a brassica such as cauliflower into that. Terminate that, or once the cash crop is harvested, short-term buckwheat crop, and then we have time to plant a fall spinach or lettuce crop. Once that crop is harvested, there's still time to slip in a cereal rye cover crop into the rotation. Terminate that the next spring. Then we plant peppers into that, follow the peppers with yellow mustard, and we're back around to the cycle. So again, 5 nice examples of cover crop, cash crop rotations, where we can see the benefits of cover crops incorporated into a cash crop rotation. So that brings us to the close of our workshop. I do want to share some resources. The publication that we just drew those rotation tables from is Cover Crops and Vegetable Production Systems from Iowa State University. It's available as a free downloadable PDF. University of Missouri Extension has a nice publication on cover crops in Missouri. That too is available as a free PDF. Managing Cover Crops Profitably. Again, I can't say enough good things about this book that was developed by USDA SARE. We'll have one more slide showing that here. And then Cover Crops for Vegetable Growers, available from Michigan State University, is an excellent resource as well. Here is the book that I've mentioned several times, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. The beginning part of the book talks about some of the general benefits of cover crops. Then we have a series of charts that are extremely valuable. Again, looking at different cover crops and their performance and roles. And these charts talk about cover crop performance and roles. They talk about cover crop seeding rates. The charts include information on cover crops for different parts of the country. And the charts also include some of the disadvantages of cover crops so that we get a balanced, complete picture of using these cover crops. The publication is available in hard copy. It's also available as an online version. And I encourage everyone to take a look at this publication for again, the complete picture on using cover crops. And again, that brings us to the close of our presentation. I want to thank you for this time together and for sharing our mutual interest in cover crops. Hannah, do we have any questions in the chat?
We don't. We had a comment in regards to a slide, in regards to changing the slide, but we don't have any questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Patrick. This was so great. I learned so much about nematodes, and I had no idea about the soil temperature. That was the temperature of the soil, keeping everything. That was incredible.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic of cover crops and how they interact with all aspects of cropping. You know, certainly with the soil environment, but also the above ground environment and the performance of the cash crop. It's a fascinating area. We're learning more about the situation. There's much we don't know. I mean, we know that the cover crops work, but in many cases we don't know why. And so through the accumulative experience of farmers and researchers, we're learning more and more about cover crops and the dynamic role they play in supporting cropping systems and soil health. So again, it's been a pleasure to be with you here today. Hannah, do you want to talk about the survey?
Oh yeah, so there's a survey at the end of this Zoom workshop, and you could please fill it out. It helps the USDA with our grant funding. We just had a person in the chat say, so helpful, thank you, looking forward to applying this through your notes.